Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is
Corey, the statistician Knockreiner. That was me nerdily pushing up my invisible glasses for those watching the video version.
Do you know that in American Sign Language, like that is literally the sign for nerd?
Oh, wow. Oh, now, hey,
Two
today I
fingers.
learned.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I know this because my daughters remind me all the time.
Gotcha.
On
Is
today's
that what they
episode,
assign to you when you get into all your cybersecurity job?
not even my job, just literally any of my hobbies.
Magic.
Yep. Anyways, on today's episode, as Mr. Statistician? Yeah, that's the word, was hinting at, we'll be covering WatchGuard Threat Lab's 2025 second half of the year Internet Security Report. I guess without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it.
Yeah, we don't have to introduce ourselves on the podcast, but for people watching the video, it's important to note that while me and Mark, I started this report, me and Mark were the first original authors of the whole thing, but now that we have a team and a whole WatchGuard Threat Labs and CSIRT team, we have co-authors. So Trevor Collins, our security engineer, and Ryan Estes also helped us write this. Before we dive into the report, for anyone that listens to the podcast or follows us in other places, you're probably used to hearing about our quarterly internet security report. But one big change you might have heard right at the beginning is this is now a biannual. So it's for the whole second half of 2025 report, and we plan on releasing 2 a year. There's a lot of reasons we made this shift, but one of them is you might have heard in past podcasts about our report that things, especially in the network attack section, but sometimes in malware, for at least the high level highlights, the data started to look the same. So we're trying to give a shift to a broader view. Instead of seeing noise created by short bursts of volatility that might happen during quarters, by having a longer stretch of data, we might normalize that data into a single analytical cycle that might make the important patterns pop up. On top of that, by the way, we want to get back to doing dedicated research in certain areas that interest our researchers when they have time. So this might also free up the WatchGuard Threat Lab to do pointed security research topics, which might lead to individual reports as well. So long story short, it's now a biannual report, and we'll see how the data changes or not over the next few years.
That means it's twice as long too, right? So 70
Thank
or 80
goodness
pages?
that's not the case. Thank goodness that's not the case. By the way, I guess it's a good time to mention, I think you'll mention it later, but there will be a lot of little intricacies of this report. Normally we do quarter over quarter comparisons because we're switching to quarters to halves. We did some work, at least in the Firebox section, to give you half over half comparisons. But the other interesting thing is I would not consider the comparisons during this first report to be, apple to apple. They're more apple to orange. One of the things we don't talk about, and maybe why I'm the statistician, or really Mark and his team are, is we actually do some statistical analysis to the data. We get rid of outliers. Specifically to make sure that there's not weird outliers poisoning the data and hiding the real trends. And while the way we are getting rid of those outliers doesn't change, doing it on a quarter basis versus doing it on a half basis kind of has an effect on the comparison. So don't pay too much. I mean, the comparisons still matter. We did some work to make them, but it won't be until we have a couple halves under our belt where the comparisons will start to show more value.
Yeah. And we don't have to spend too much time on the agenda, but we'll start by just going through the Firebox feed, which is data from fireboxes that have opted into sharing with us around the world. It's a view of malware trends and network attack trends, and also some malicious domains from the DNS Watch firewalling service. Then we go into the endpoint section. We'll talk about a few key trends that are a bit different once you look at the endpoint versus the network perimeter. And then we'll end with some tips you can take back to protect yourselves against all the stuff we're going to scare you with over the next.
The point of this report isn't actually to scare you, even though we joke. The main reason we do this, the main reason we're always paying attention to threat actors, isn't because we want to kind of pump them up and make them seem huge. It's more to figure out what the trends are so that you have solid defenses to match the current trends.
Yep. And then real quick on the Firebox feed, for those that aren't familiar, it's our name for the threat intelligence that we get from our partners and customers that have opted into sharing it with us. If you're a WatchGuard Firebox administrator, under the general settings or the global settings, depending on the UI you use to manage it, there's a little checkbox for sending threat intelligence back to WatchGuard. All that means is anytime one of the security services detects something and blocks it, we get a anonymized report with a bit of information about that threat so that we can take a step back and paint a picture globally around what is impacting our customers and their customers around the world. It's made up of our 3 layers of anti-malware, the signature-based gateway antivirus, the artificial intelligence. I don't think we're allowed to say machine learning anymore in 2026.
Yeah,
But
we have to use the buzzword.
AI-powered intelligent AV, which uses machine learning under the hood to predict whether something's malicious or not, and an APT blocker, which is the cloud sandboxing anti-malware service that literally detonates it in the cloud and just watches its behaviors to make that determination. I'll also go over the intrusion prevention service, which is a signature-based network exploit detection. We'll go over a few trends on that. And then DNS Watch as our DNS firewalling service, which is a optional feature within the Firebox 2, where we can get a view of malware command and control, phishing campaigns, and all sorts of interesting activity on the domain name level. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into the start of the malware trends, Corey. And first off, for those that have been following our report for the last couple of years, you'll notice the numbers are a little bit different. Like Corey said, it's not apples to apples. It's a bit more of apples to oranges because when we look over a broader range of time, we're able to include more data as statistically relevant from all of the devices reporting over that time. So looking at this half of the year, though, we saw around 100 or 1,260 malware detections per firebox globally on average, which is a massive number.
Yeah, by the way, if you'd let me pause here, we specifically pick per firebox now rather than this big raw global number, because those of you that are listening, whether you're managed service providers, partners, or customers, it gives you context about how much one of just your fireboxes does. So it's good to know that, over 1,000 threats within a half is a lot of this is just malware, not everything else. But we do a little extrapolation. While we don't have every single, we actually probably only have maybe, I don't know, 10%ish of active fireboxes sharing this data with us. If we extrapolate and imagine every active firebox, not even every firebox out there, but the ones that have active licensing, that would translate to over 500 million malware for across all the fireboxes for the first or the second half of last year. I think the number was something like 567 million with change. So that 1260 is a big number individually, but just so you know, it's over 500 million globally just on the network side of things.
Pretty crazy. And so malware overall was up slightly from the first half of the year, about 26%. And this was mostly due to a pretty big surge in the like traditional signature-based, or at least signature caught malware that we saw. There was an 89% increase to 978 detections per firebox of things caught by gateway antivirus, which is, Corey will get a bit more into the weeds on like evasive versus not evasive malware in a second. But that's a bit abnormal compared to what we've seen over the last decade or so as we've been doing this report. The evasive malware threats were down a bit, around 16% for APT blocker and 49% for intelligent AV. But an interesting trend that we dive into in the report itself is that 96% of all of the malware threats we saw arrived over an encrypted connection. And unfortunately, only a small portion of our customers, around like 20% last time we checked, actually turn on HTTPS inspection, the free feature on the Firebox, to inspect those connections and potentially catch these threats. So if you're not inspecting your traffic, you're missing the majority of threats that pass through your perimeter, unfortunately.
Yeah, the real
But
high level part of these highlights would be malware volume is up, but the more sophisticated and technically evasive malware is down. Now, the evasive story is both ways. What you just mentioned was so much of malware is going through encrypted channels because the web is encrypted. So that is one of the indicators that when we generalize evasive in a non-technical way, we're looking at two things. We're looking at how much arrives through encrypted channels, but we're also more looking at technical evasion, like packing, encrypting, signs of sophistication, like looking for and killing security services. And so the sign of evasive malware being there somewhat is the encrypted channel part. But the fact that IAV and APD blocker are so down means the technically evasive new looking malware is not happening during the second half, which I'll get into in a second.
Yeah, you want to go ahead and show
Yeah.
off the next section?
For those that watch us every quarter and soon to be every half year, you probably know this spiel, but I wish we updated the video version of this slide to say zero-day malware. One of the biggest parts of our report is reporting on something we call zero-day malware. And just because zero-day is such a common network term for zero-day exploits, we want to make sure you know that this number that we call zero-day malware is different. To us, this means malware that is not detected by a signature. It's detected by a proactive technique. It could be a human for the first time, but more likely it's going to be AI or behavioral analysis. And if it's getting past the signatures on day one and it requires proactive detection to find, we call it zero-day malware. As Mark and I just alluded, based on the fact that APT blocker and IAV hits are down, zero-day malware for the second half of last year was very low. Only 23% of malware needed the more advanced protection to catch. Now, in context, that's still a quarter of malware. You still want that protection. But that's gone up and down over the years, but I would say that the first 5 years of our report, that number was constantly half or more. It was always half of malware. It sometimes reached the high 70s. In the previous 2 years from now, the past 2 years, it has been going down, but strangely, in the first half of this year, it rose. I believe that this chart almost flip-flopped where I can't remember if it was 76 or 77%, but it was almost the opposite, where almost 3/4 of malware were zero-day, whereas the second half of the year, it dropped to under a quarter. And the other kind of strange thing here is we mentioned that most malware is detected through encrypted channels. We see most malware using that, TLS over encrypted web traffic. But usually, whatever the zero-day malware number is, when we look at zero-day malware through the encrypted channel, it's a little higher, which makes sense. Like people that are already making sure that their malware is delivered from secure-looking servers might also take the extra work to make it technically evasive too. But for some new reason, that's only 16%. So we actually saw less zero-day malware detection and mostly signature-based detection in encrypted channels too. The obvious question is why? It's hard for us to know because this telemetry, we want to be quantifiable, scientific. We do look for what malware authors might be doing anecdotally that could explain this, but it's hard for us to know why this is happening right now. It will be interesting to see how it changes or not in the first half of this year.
Yeah. So let's talk about a couple of the specific threats, and definitely recommend checking out the full report to get all of our analysis of the top malware threats, the most widespread that we'll go over in a second, and like specific analysis of new threats that we saw in this period. But just to pick a few takeaways from the ones that we detected in the most volume for the second half of the year, you'll notice like 6 out of 10 are all droppers. And that's kind of par for the course. At the network perimeter, we typically catch the first stage of a malware attack, which is almost always a dropper, something designed to just go scope out the system and then go grab a secondary payload, which will ultimately lead to the final payload of a remote access Trojan or ransomware or whatever the threat actor is trying to do. So it makes sense that we'd see so many droppers at the network perimeter. Another interesting one in there was Impacket coming in at number 6. It's a really popular tool for both red team penetration testers and cyber criminals. A Python script effectively to help facilitate credential dumping and authentication relay attacks. As with many tools that were quote unquote designed for legitimate purposes, when they become as effective as they are, the threat actors start using them as well too. And so we saw a lot of in packet detected at the network perimeter too. And that goes along with what we'll see a little bit on the endpoint too, of a lot of script-based threats as well throughout the quarter. And then finally, another interesting one in there, I guess three, were all about attacking Linux systems. Like two of them were to try and infect them and turn them into botnets, which threat actors could then use to do like denial of service attacks or even just proxy their traffic through them to make it look like it's coming from a residential IP or something within the same country as their final target. But then also a specific signature, application.proxy.otn, designed to catch proxying malware, where an attacker will compromise the system and then use that system to effectively proxy their attacks to other victims as well. This is why, like, personally, I don't think geolocation blocking is really a super effective feature at blocking threat actors, because the reality is they can go lease access to compromised devices within the country to make their connection look like it's coming from there, or use cloud services in the country. A motivated attacker
Every
can get around
botnet has
geolocation
a
blocking.
proxy, a SOCKS 5, old school SOCKS 5 proxy module too, it feels like. So the point is every botnet has globally diverse victims, and the whole point for the attacker, like if I'm a Russia-based attacker that owns a botnet of victims all over the world, I can choose where my attacks come from. So I absolutely agree, Mark.
Yeah.
By the way, we talked about this on the webinar earlier, so it won't be news to you, but we have been talking about the difference between network detected malware and endpoint detected malware, which Mark mentioned early on just now in a lot of these reports. And the fact that what we see, the reason we have malware sections for both endpoint and network is we're usually seeing initial droppers and stagers when it's hitting the network at first. And that makes sense. If you can block that at the network, they never get to the final payload. So you have to see what hits the endpoint to understand what the real kind of motive and final malware is. But I do find it interesting that I think even the non-droppers support the same story. Those Linux hack tools and the proxy related threat targeting Linux systems, while not always, those are mostly designed to attack the network device itself. Yes, they can be IoT devices like webcams too, but they're often just consumer routers and stuff, and they're bots and Trojans designed to try to get the entire consumer or small endpoint routing device and use it as a proxy or even a bastion host to get into the rest of the network. So the only time we kind of see final stage malware is when it's a type of malware that's going to attack network-based or IoT-based systems that are Linux-based. And even the script, as you talk about later in the endpoint section, Mark, when we talk about vectors, the script is not the final payload. It's often the malicious script. The Python tools are designed to be script-based access that maybe allows you to, I guess you could do entirely living off the land with them if you wanted to, but also often to install a final payload after you have the privilege to run these scripts. So yep. I think even the non-droppers kind of support the entire story that what we always see at the network isn't like individual ransomware samples or crypto miners you hear in the news typically. It's the actual staging malware designed to deliver that later. Cool. Moving on to widespread malware. By the way, like Mark said, we're going to go fast, so read the report. But the section he just shared is purely malware by raw volume. So it's definitely the threats that were detected the most. But it could be 100 devices in one country detecting them 100,000 times each. We don't really go into depth there, which means it may not be the threats that are touching the most fireboxes out there. The top widespread list is more about showing you what malware is affecting almost all of you who have fireboxes, which ones are hitting most of those devices. And that's what this list is. I'm not going to go into all the regional stuff on the podcast, which is interesting for some people, but just to give you the high level on this one, two of the ones that start with exploit, one is math type blah, 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 and the other one has a 2017 CVE. At a high level, these are both old Office vulnerabilities. Even the one that isn't a 27 CV, the math type one, happened to be a flaw that was found in 2017 when I looked it up. And both of these are just flaws in a very old version of Office that allowed various Office documents to be booby trapped in a way that they could execute code. Uh, I think the math type one could come in almost any document, a PowerPoint, a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet. And the second one was most commonly found in RTF, but could also maybe affect any documents, because I feel like the some of the technical support of different things like RTF format is in all of them. So long story short, those two exploits were malicious Office files that could have executed something. Hopefully, no one is cheap enough that they haven't been updating Office since 2017. So the
What?
good news.
You don't think
By the way,
anyone is
say what
cheap
you're going to
enough?
say, because I said hopefully, and I know that's not the case. What were you going to say, Mark?
The cynic in me says that's a high likelihood. I mean, it's
Yeah,
around the era where people were transitioning to Microsoft 365, and if you don't want to
yeah,
pay a
cloud
monthly
versus
subscription,
local.
you are
Yeah.
permanently stuck on one of these old garbage versions of it.
I would say, like, I absolutely agree with you. That's why my hopefully was intended kind of sarcastically. I will say, in a business environment, which most of our users are in, I I would say I would hope this is a little less likely in a business environment. In a consumer environment, I've seen some very old installs of Office because consumers don't really want to repay for the same package over and over. And you make the excellent point of the cloud one is the one you have to maintain a subscription for. If you bought a version back when it was standalone, you can keep that for as long as you want to deal with the old version. But nonetheless, if you are someone running a modern version of Office and you've patched, you should be fine. Uh, the one of them, the one that starts with heuristic, or shortened HEUR, means Zard. Any sort of heuristics detection isn't like a single signature to catch one flaw. It's kind of a heuristic set of rules that hopefully can catch a family of different malware. In this case, the family would be Zard, sometimes called smoke loader. And both those are modular remote access Trojans, or rats. A rat is just it's a backdoor. It's designed to give an attacker remote access once they've hijacked your computer. What they do with that remote access could be anything. The modular part means typically they can load different modules. If they want to steal information, they load the module that does that and send a command. They can install additional payloads. Maybe ransomware is their ultimate motive, and they can install that later. Or they can just spy on you, run local commands, steal data, do whatever they want to through the back channel. Smutsy, I won't talk about Trojan Smutsy. It's one that's been on our lists, sometimes top volume malware too, for multiple years. We've talked about it in past reports. It is a Trojan similar to the one above. And the final one is some adware. Adware Krixos is basically a type of adware that helps deliver ads to the initial victim, but is also spread through malvertising itself. So you might have encountered getting this by being on a site that had some malicious ad pop up that helped deliver this in some sort of way. So that is the widespread list. There's also a lot about encrypted malware, and is also some 3 specific samples that might go deeper into our list if you check the report out. But why don't we transition to network?
Yeah. So for our network attacks, on average in the second half of the year, each firebox had 845 network attack detections, which is a massive number, but it was actually down slightly from the first half of the year when we look at half over half trends. Now, one thing with our network attack section, it is almost entirely automated tools. Attackers will go try common types of exploits against just any exposed web application indiscriminately. They'll try very common or vulnerabilities in very common applications across the entire internet. Like, for example, when proxy logon CVE 2021 26855 popped up 5 years ago, it quickly became one of the top numbers. In fact, it reached number 1 in our top network attacks by volume very quickly there, and it stayed in the top 10 for quite some time. The reality is, like, the entire internet right now is scanned continuously by threat actors and by even just quote unquote legitimate tools like Census and Shodan that build databases of every internet exposed system out there. Like, when you turn on a new system and give it a public IP address, within minutes and sometimes within seconds, someone will have scanned it, fingerprinted it to see exactly what's running on it, and stored it in a database somewhere. What that means is even if it's not vulnerable to something right now, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, if a new vulnerability gets disclosed and you don't patch it literally immediately, threat actors will go through their databases to go find anything running those services and try and pop them as quickly as possible. So anything exposed to the internet is high risk, which means you need to be diligent about protecting it. But when it comes to the top network attacks for the quarter, you'll notice a lot of web threats in there, and specifically signatures designed to catch just common categories of exploit attempts against applications, like cross-site scripting and directory traversal. I'm trying to grab the etc passwd file off a Linux server. These are all signatures designed to catch just that type of activity, no matter what the application is. And so it makes sense seeing them regularly in our top 10 list here. It is unfortunate that in the year 2026, we still have enough SQL injection attempts and attacks for it to show up as number, 6 in the list there. But that is the reality we're in, where, and I don't know, Corey, I feel like it's going to get a little bit worse maybe before it gets better, thanks to all the vibe coded garbage that's going to show up over the next couple of years.
That's an excellent point. And despite that, I think we've talked about it. Yes, SQL injection and cross-site are old classes of vulnerability that every developer knows shouldn't exist. I will say, to be fair, some of where they happen are like, we've talked about it before, but like when people were first doing SQL injection, it was because like the web dialog for entering a username had a concatenated SQL query that you could just in the actual name add SQL right there. Nowadays, I feel like, this is anecdotal, I feel like these cross-site scripting and directory traversal are more buried in behind the scene processes that the normal user doesn't realize they have control of. There's no dialogue, they can type something. But people with Burp Suite and know all the headers that web clients and servers share with each other and all the weird interactions going on that a user technically has control of if they can mess with what their browser is doing, but they're hard. I think they're one of the reasons they exist, even though they shouldn't, is they're in more complex hidden situations. So between one, vibe coding may be introducing an old class of vulnerability because it's based on old vulnerable code, and the fact that the web has become super complex with a lot of little hidden processes that you really, as a user, have control of, whether you know you do or not. That's why I think they're still there. And I think even a developer that understands these are there probably thinks, can a user control this? And they think about the most obvious ways users have control, but they don't think about uploading an image that has customized metadata in the image and something parsing the metadata of the image to classify it. Is the thing vulnerable to cross-site scripting, for instance?
Yep. Agreed. And so in the report, we go into way more detail. We even look at beyond the top 10 and look at the top 50 network attacks to see what was new in this half of the year. So definitely check it out to get all of the details. But for time's sake, Corey, you want to continue on to the DNS watch section?
Yeah. So this is where I get to take credit for Mark's work. This is a section Mark wrote, but I will say that if you're a YouTube viewer,
okay.
Yeah, whatever. How many presentations have you given that were 75% my slides? Speaking of which, I did do the slides for this. The DNS section or the domain attack sections changed a little in that we used to highlight compromised sites, phishing sites, and basically malicious malware delivery or CNC sites. We'd give you the entire top 10. But one of the reasons we changed to half years is that became it was the same sites over and over. So now we've changed it to just picking out some new highlights and going into more detail and analyzing the threats they deliver. And the two that you picked, which I think are pretty cool, one is Remcos. This is a RAT, a remote access Trojan, like I talked about before. Remcos is just a popular one that is sold as malware as a service that any dummy that doesn't have technical knowledge can still use. But you went into some detail how Remcos was delivered. One of the common ways we saw during this time period was a phishing email. In this case, it was a phishing email that was from a popular air compressor manufacturer, but it looks like an invoice. And I think any security expert or even IT person is used to the fake invoice emails. So this really followed that fake invoice email style. These emails could have links, or they can have zip attachments or normal attachments. In this case, sorry, my slide was not going forward. In this case, I think it directly had what looked like a Word attachment. It had an icon that looked like a docx icon attachment, and docx was part of the name of the attachment. But anyone looking closely could see that it ended in .js, which means it's actually JavaScript. Looks like a Word document, definitely not a Word document. There was some basic obfuscation used in the JavaScript. In the report, you can see a much clearer screenshot of this, but this is basically some of the JavaScript, which was, it looked like gobbledygook foreign language, like non-existent gibberish words, but really part of the JavaScript would decode that. I think base 64, as always, was the decoder used for part of it, into actual script. And if someone actually ran that script, it went to the site itself, which in this case was, I'm not going to give you the exact one, but it had SMS and SZFang in it, and was a .com site. And basically it grabbed a blob that was a malicious PowerShell that it ran under the command line. If you ran that PowerShell, essentially it would go and get the Remco's Trojan, and bam, you were infected. So one of the most popular domains people were clicking on was from, they weren't actually clicking on it. They were opening an attachment in email. But when it went to the DNS lookup for that site, that's where our DNS firewall, DNS Watch, blocked it. The other one I'll spend less time on, but basically one of the other popular links that we saw in the top sites that we blocked with DNS Watch was something that, a site that was delivering Redline Stealer. Actually, the first site was a different one. It was actually, the first one I should have said was Malverneg. This one was the SMS SZFang one. But that site wasn't the direct site the attacker probably went to. What happened, or the victim probably went to, what happened is the victim probably went to another domain that got a fake software update pop-up. And it looked like they were getting a software update. And if they followed the software update, they would get to the domain I mentioned before, SMSSCFang. And that one we saw hit it started in October 9th and generated almost 3,000 hits pretty quickly. And if you did get there, that's where it would try to deliver the Redline info stealer malware to you. Info stealer, pretty obvious what it is, what it sounds like. It's something that will try to steal all your credentials from your web browser. Also will steal your cookies to sites you've visited recently in hopes to just get past credentials in MFA. If you have cryptocurrency wallets, it tries to get into them, and it will check the rest of your system information. And even though it's more info stealer, almost any malware also has the capability typically to install something else. So it could be an avenue for the attacker to install more. The big thing about this one is it primarily targeted Japan. All of the, or most of the detections we saw for it, for this domain, were happening from Japan. And the file names Mark looked at associated with this were all file names written in Japanese. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a Japanese threat actor, but they were going after watering, or using watering holes that targeted Japan. So kind of interesting. Let's jump into some tips for the network section. That's weird.
Yeah, man. Slide malfunction. So
yeah, go power.
First off, yeah, the majority of the malware that we saw this quarter, man, old habits are going to be hard to break.
Yeah.
In the second half of the year, came over an encrypted connection. And so if you are not inspecting your HTTPS traffic, you're missing just about everything that passes through your perimeter, which means you're putting all your eggs in the basket of your endpoint protection, which hopefully is strong enough to catch it. But I don't know about you, Corey. I wouldn't want to place all of my hope on one single security control to defend me against what's out there. Now, I get it. Like, it can be a bit difficult.
If it's scissors, Mark, if it's scissors,
cutting the cable,
your Ethernet connection, that might work.
That is fair. I get it though. Like, it takes a bit of time to set up HTTPS decryption on any UTM or NGFW appliance. But that time you spend setting it up has massive returns on investment with detecting threats as it passes through the perimeter. If you're a WatchGuard Fire Cloud customer, you get the benefit of all of that decryption happening seamlessly without you needing to mess around with certificates too, which is one of the great benefits of that ZTNA like service, to catch these threats no matter where they are passing through, encrypted or not. But take the time to go set up HTTPS decryption on your perimeter to make sure that you have visibility into everything going in and out of your office workloads.
Absolutely. The other tip is we're running out of ways to tell you to patch. Everyone, I think if you're in IT or security, you know you should patch. And why is this important? A lot of the attacks and malware we were talking about, whether they be network or malware, they're not the new zero-day stuff. They're old stuff. If you patch, most of those IPS network attack triggers would not affect you at all. Now, the reason just saying patch is not sufficient is we do know how hard it is to patch a typical mid-sized business with complex hybrid environments, business cases that have to keep things running. You have to patch Docker containers, you have to patch hardware and firmware. There's so many different systems. Sometimes you have to keep an older system because of dependencies on it until you can get the business to update that system. So our key advice here goes with what you saw in Mark's network section, which is internet-facing web applications. If you're going to focus on something, at the very least, patch those internet-facing web applications immediately. As Mark was saying, besides botnets just mass scanning and exploiting randomly IPs on the internet, things like Shodan and Census are always keeping track and telling the world what services every single IP on the internet is serving. So it's an easy button for attackers to find exactly what you're hosting at a place. So at the very least, even if patching everything all the time is hard, get those internet-facing web applications as quickly as possible, because our network attacks are always seem to be heavily focused on web applications over other network services. And it's the internet-facing ones you have to worry about.
Then finally, make sure you're blocking JavaScript as an email attachment on your email security service or in your MTA, your mail server itself. Like, there's no legitimate reason to be sending JavaScript files attached to emails or in zip archives attached to emails. Like, you may think, if you're a technical individual, like you might have a legitimate reason to pass around JavaScript files to other people via email, but just don't normalize it. Don't make people think that that's safe, because it'll just train them to trust it and potentially fall victim to one of these incidents. And when it comes to inspecting emails too, make sure that your security service can unpack any zip archives. Attackers will commonly put their actual payload, like these JavaScript files, inside of a zip archive to evade tools that don't peel back the onion to see what's on the inside. But I mean, come on, we shouldn't be passing around JavaScript attached to emails. So just block it. Same with LNK files, to add to that too.
Yeah, LNK files, EXEs, batch files, COM files. There's a lot of obvious stuff you can block. The follow-up too is most devices like ours, when a JavaScript file is within a zip file, not only can we decompress it, but we can allow a certain amount of layers of decompression if it's compressed multiple times. So make sure you have that enabled so that you can find the JavaScript in the zips. Let's transfer to endpoint threats, Mark. And this, of course, is where WatchGuard EPDR and in some cases, the older version, AD360, which is the Panda version of it, pretty much the same thing, although we've improved it, come to play. If you summarize our highlights in the network malware section, we told you malware volume was way up, but sophisticated and really evasive threats as far as zero-day was way down. In a nutshell, it was just the opposite for the endpoint. Now, the one thing I want to share, we have over 7 million endpoints out there we're protecting. And if you get just the pure raw volume of every detection, it's going to easily be in the hundreds of millions or billions for each half, just like the network, perhaps more. But I would say the chart on the left, total malware threats, is the closest we have to volume in the endpoint section, but you have to realize it doesn't measure the pure volume. What we're really counting here is if each piece of malware can be recognized by a hash, a signature just for that specific variant, we count it as one. That malware could actually have been detected 500,000 times on 200,000 endpoints, but it's only going to show up one on this list. So what we're really talking about here is the total unique malware variants we saw during the quarter. And as you can see, while it's not quite volume, there's much less unique we're seeing much less malware in general during Q3 and Q4, or the second half of last year, than we were the first half. In Q3, it did technically rise. It actually hit the highest quarter in Q3 as far as unique threats, but then it dropped so low in Q4 that overall it's still lower than the 2 quarters before if you were to add it up average wise. On the flip side, let's talk about never before seen malware, the equivalent of 0-day, the malware that is the first time we've ever seen that hash. Maybe signatures didn't catch it. Maybe it took our cloud or machine learning or AI based detection. That exploded in Q4 and also was high in Q3. So really the trend here is, as far as just overall volume of malware, there were still a lot of malware out there, but the volume is kind of it dropped as far as the amount of different threats we saw. But for brand new stuff, it was much higher than we saw at the network level. It really exploded over 1,500%. It exploded over 1,500% essentially. So we saw a lot of new threats, especially during Q4 of last year. Another thing I'm just going to highlight really quickly is our EPDR product is cool. It uses a lot of different technologies, both local and in the cloud, to catch malware. One of my favorites is the Zero Trust application service, where if you have that turned on in lock mode, it will not run a file until it knows 100% if it's good or bad. And how do I know 100%? It's because it has to go through every single one of these detection technologies. And the last technology, for the rare case where a file, even after all our AI based and behavioral detection, maybe we're suspicious of it 70%, but we can't say for sure, it will go through a human researcher with a very tight SLA to get you the answer to that very quickly. Anyways, some of the ways we catch it could be signatures. I talk about those a lot. We have both signatures locally on the endpoint, but when we say cloud, for performance and other reasons, we have a subset of important signatures right there locally. But over the 30 years of our history having endpoint software, the cloud has billions of signatures. So when we submit it to the cloud, it gets even more signatures. That's what cloud represents. When we submit it to the cloud, it goes through not just one AI-based analysis, but multiple machine learning models designed to catch different types of malware in different ways. It goes through the same type of behavioral sandbox destination Mark talked about before. And as I mentioned at the end of the day, usually it's a small set of files that reaches this, but it turns a lot out for new, never before seen malware. There was a significant amount of it that we had to kind of identify through manual attestation, which is a human. The main takeaway from this, it hasn't changed much through the whole year, but most malware gets detected by our AI-based and behavioral analysis. Signature, this means that evasive malware, ones that are polymorphic and changing, is the more common thing nowadays. And that's why it takes that machine learning, AI, and behavioral analysis to catch it. It was high all through the year. It did get higher during the second half of the year for sure. And then second up is, of course, cloud signatures. That helps to having those billions of signatures. But finally, there was a significant amount of manual attestation that we saw throughout the year. I think it averages out, while we saw it a little low in Q3 and a little higher in Q4, it averages out to a significant amount of new malware does need that manual attestation too. Finally, why don't you talk about attack vectors, Mark?
Yeah, real quick. So one of the other things we track in the endpoint section is what was the initial technique that the attacker used in order to kick off that endpoint attack. Did they use a scripting engine? Did they use a built-in Microsoft executable? Did they exploit a web browser? There's a bunch of different ways that attackers can start off an incident on an endpoint. And if you've frequently read the report, you'll remember not even that long ago, about a year ago or so, scripts were king. Like 90% of the malware that we saw originated with a script at one point. And it was like 99% of that was
90% of that
PowerShell
was
too.
PowerShell
Yeah,
script. Yeah.
exactly. But the times have changed and it's actually dropped quite a bit. Where by the time we get to the end of the year, in the quarter 4 portion of this half, scripts were just down to around 17% of the malware origination that we saw. And making up for some of that drop, Windows binaries and executables jumped up to around 39%. So when we take a step back and look holistically at just living off the land techniques, including scripts and Windows executables, it was still the majority of malware threats there. But scripts specifically have gone down. And that could be because attackers are realizing that, EDR tools are getting better and even endpoint protection tools are getting better at catching a malicious script file as it runs on a computer. And so instead, by pivoting to those built-in tools that come with your operating system, they can abuse a legitimate program to do a lot of illegitimate activity on the endpoint and stay hidden for longer if there aren't good EDR controls installed on that system. Browsers used to be a like fraction of a percent, I think. When I think back a couple of years ago, that was up to around 14% of all malware origination for the half of the year. And Chrome specifically was around 80% of that too, which kind of makes sense. Chrome has like 90 whatever percent of the market share. I guess that means if they've only got 80% of the attacks, they're doing a little bit better than everyone else out there, right? Just doing the math in my head on that. But long story short, the main takeaway was living off the land was still very popular, with more than half of the total malware we saw originating with living off the land techniques.
I agree. Well, we might find it interesting that scripts in Windows is flip-flopping because it does show that the actual MITRE techniques are changing. Like Mark said, to us, both of those represent living off the land. So while it might be technically interesting seeing the flip-flop, it really does come down to living off the land attacks. If I were to add one thing, other seems to be increasing over time. And if you read the report, you can get the full description of other. But I find one of the big things in other are piracy related. Like I think Ryan mentions auto KMS a lot in other, and that's a way to kind of hijack and pirate the Windows activation process on Microsoft-based tools. So besides the living off the land takeaways, make sure your users aren't pirating stuff because it's a good way to bring malware into your network. So that's it for the report. Why don't we get past that little PowerPoint bug and talk about the final protection tips? I'm going to start with the first, but I'm not really going to mention it much because yes, we repeated this tip because it was really important. With like, I think it was 96% or 97% of malware going over encrypted channels. We think it's very important that you inspect and get visibility into HTTPS and TLS in many different ways. Use that firewall feature. If you have a firewall, even if you're not paying for the cool extra services, I think you should, especially for zero-day malware. But even if you're not, this decryption feature is just part of the base license. So you have it. It's free. Use it. I will say some other cool things Mark mentioned in our webinar version of this is add other layers too. Like obviously endpoint protection is that second layer. Once it gets to the endpoint, it's decrypted and that's where EPDR can help. But as Mark mentioned, no protection is 100% or infallible. But one cool new protection I think is awesome is the Fire Cloud. If you haven't heard of Fire Cloud, it basically the version of what we have today brings you a firewall as a service, a secure web gateway, and zero trust network access, all with the total Fire Cloud license. And the important part here is that firewall as a service. It's basically if you have remote users that don't have a hardware firebox, they just have a laptop, you can have Fire Cloud giving them the same network security services that you get from a firewall. From the firebox itself, and add EPDR to it as well, and you have extra safety. Long story short, though, by the way, Fire Cloud is doing this automatically for you. because it's a firewall as a service delivered through our infrastructure of points of presence or POPs, we take care of all the certificate management to make sure that as it's passing our point of presence, we're decrypting and re-encrypting it. We're not snooping. We want to keep it secure throughout, but we're using the capability of our certificates to make sure that malware and IPS inspections still happen with the encrypted traffic.
And then second, we just talked about it, how threat actors are leaning heavily on living off the land techniques to try and evade traditional endpoint security tools that just look for a malware payload, a file being delivered onto the service itself. Whereas EDR tools are capable of catching legitimate applications being used illegitimately. The fact is right now, like EDR is table stakes. If you're not using EDR on your systems, you have a critical gap in your ability to detect modern threats that arrive onto the endpoint. And man, if you pair that with not inspecting HTTPS traffic, you're basically standing there with your pants down against the current threat landscape. And I would
thank you.
not envy you being in that position right now.
You might even be bending over Bohica.
God, but beyond that, terrible image. Even beyond the security controls themselves, like you can take additional steps on the endpoint to try and harden it against illegitimate use. Like maybe you're in a situation where you can straight up block PowerShell on an endpoint, at least for certain users that really have no need to ever use PowerShell. Disable or remove other unwanted or unused applications or components within Windows to prevent threat actors from potentially abusing them. Just take steps to make sure that you aren't leaving too much of an attack surface on the endpoint to, again, have those layers of security to protect against these threats that we're seeing, abusing legitimate tools. Or you want to grab the last
And
one?
finally, at the end of the day, you need to update your security awareness training to make sure that your users understand the latest email and malware as a service lures and trends. I always say, let's imagine a world that's hypothetical. It's never going to imagine, but let's imagine a world where we find a way to prevent every technical way to hack a system. All the fancy technical ways that don't need any user action or even minimal user action to hack something. All the vulnerabilities, they're gone. They're all fixed, or some security thing really does detect them all. That doesn't mean hacks won't happen. It's just going to change to social engineering. Hackers don't hack in nowadays, they log in, and these attacks where they steal a credential, there's often no vulnerabilities. It's just tricking a user to do something that gets the attacker some information like credentials or other things. Then they just log in and use your own normal tools as though they're the user to do every bad thing they want. So it's very important to make sure you have some protection against just that social engineering. In this report, you heard about how Remcos uses the phishing emails that pretend to be invoices. In past reports, we've talked about all kinds of different ways. Nowadays, AI and deepfakes are heavily being used to make emails very targeted and to make lures more enticing and more legitimate by faking even the face, video, and audio of C-level employees. So make sure to update your security awareness. Every time you learn a new example of some crazy phishing lure that seems pretty legitimate, which is the kind of thing we want to share in our reports, make sure you have some training telling your users to watch out for those techniques, because we make some great technical controls that will really protect you from a ton of stuff, and in some cases can save the user from themselves. Things like DNS watch and malware stripping will at least prevent your users from shooting themselves when they do click on things. It is still very important to get your users up to date.
And speaking of education, you can check out the report on WatchGuard.com/security report. Definitely go grab the whole thing and read it in its entirety. And man, I don't know, Corey. I feel like the best security control is probably your suggestion of just scissors to the network cable at this point.
I go both ways with AI. AI is going to fix a lot of stuff, but man, it's getting scary out there. Things are going to be moving fast, so you better have security that moves fast too.
Yep. Hold on to your butts, everyone.
We can do it. We'll be fine. Humanity survives. We're like the cockroaches of the universe.
We are the cockroaches of the universe. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Again, you can check out our full security report on watchguard.com/security report. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on the social medias. On Blue Sky at itsmark.me, Corey's at SecAdept. We're also both on Instagram at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.